Hello and welcome to this video on life and viruses. In the tree of life there is every living creature that we understand the origin of, our own included. When in a biology class you could learn of the 7 kingdoms of life: Plantae, Animalia, Protozoa, Fungi, Eubacteria, Archaebacteria, and Chromista. What is missing from this list are viruses. This is because they are traditionally not considered a living creature. This comes from the nature of life, how it propagates and develops. Features largely missing or drastically different in viruses. Life is generally defined by a series of cycles. Whether that is a Disney song sung by lions, wildebeests, and meerkats, or that proposed by Darwin. In biology, life has a more specific meaning. It's largely defined by 7 criteria. The first and simplest of which is organization. Living things are organized. This means they're made up of coordinated and generally specialized parts. The human hand being a good example. It's drastically different to the rest of the limb and performs a specific function. It has greater dexterity. In order to gain that dexterity, it gives up the strength of the rest of the arm. This scales up and down. Then you have metabolism. That is, there is a vast number of chemical reactions going on inside the organism. These allow it to achieve something. Generally speaking, it's resisting entropy, and thereby becoming more organized, at least temporarily. Then we have homeostasis. And in the human body, this is ensuring that its temperature remains around 37 degrees centigrade, that the pH of the blood doesn't shift much from about 7.4, that there is constantly oxygen in the body. The list goes on, but things that are essential and must be maintained for functionality. This homeostasis exists in all organisms that are alive. Homeostasis is relatively essential for growth and development. All living organisms will undergo some sort of growth, whether this is growing in size or number, the latter being reproduction, and the fifth requirement for something to be living. It must be able to reproduce itself and thereby create new organisms. Reproduction does not need to be sexual. As is with humans, 2 are required, but with many bacteria, a single organism can create 2 by asexual reproduction. Reproduction is generally in response to the environment. A favorable environment will lead to a response, and that response being to increase in number. If we're talking about something more complex, for example, a tree or a human being, they can respond to various stimuli, such as threats, and release or respond in certain ways. All of these things are necessary in order to conduct evolution, responding to the environment and acquiring certain traits, reproducing to pass those traits on to the next generation, and so on, all play into the process of evolution and selection of those traits which are desirable. Knowing what is required for something to be considered alive, let's look at a few examples of what is living. Just about everything from a human to tree and down to bacterium is made from 1 or more cells. Human bodies are made from many different cell types. Cardiomyocytes in the heart, hepatocytes in the liver, epithelium for your skin, and so on. Plants have a similar degree of complexity, with dedicated cell types for specific functions. Bacteria, due to their solitary nature, still contain highly specialized functionality and regions in their cells. These are organelles, layers to the cell membrane, channels and gates for the selective passage of molecules, and so on. Each has a niche role or can perform a utilitarian function. Consider the human body and the way it's structured. How many organs and systems exist that each require their own particular cell type? You have your brain and the neural system. You have your liver and the hepatocytes, heart, lungs, GI tract, kidneys, and the reproductive organs. Then there are special endocrine and exocrine tissues. Plants require the ability to turn CO2 and water into oxygen. They require the ability to produce enough cellulose to create a structure that allows the plant to be strong and large. They require flowers to have sexual reproduction. Plants are complex, not necessarily as complex as a human in all cases, but still there is substantial specialization in functionality. Even the microorganisms, like a fungi, mushrooms for example, all work together for a collective purpose. Next is the idea that everything that eats poops. This is more scientifically known as metabolism, the breakdown and reassembly or conversion of things to create energy. Humans rely on glucose and amino acids. These provide the necessary means of generating ATP. And then you have the waste products of CO2 and water. The human body must be able to break down amino acids and then reassemble them into proteins. It must be able to disassemble and reuse receptors. There are many things that must be metabolized, and most of these will produce some degree of toxic waste product. If not through the normal processes of the body, then through the metabolism of foreign compounds and chemicals. Consider medication that you consume can either go through a first passage or be directly used. First passage is a process by which medication is changed in the liver to become functional for its intended purpose. Under varying circumstances, this change is more obvious than in other cases. Lactic acid from muscles and anaerobic exercise is a good example of this. The body adjusts to needing a different energy source, and the process of that metabolism leads to waste products. Of course, humans are not the only ones able to meet their needs under varying circumstances. The simplest example is yeast. It can turn glucose into energy and ethanol. Admittedly, this comes at the cost of efficiency, but it still works. All of this is done to create energy. Energy is needed for one major purpose, homeostasis, which is essential to the function of life. Any kind of wild fluctuation in the function of a cell or organism would lead to failure of essential functionality. Think about what would happen if your blood could turn to an acid or base with little to no warning or impetus. The same thing with blood pressure. What if it suddenly increased or decreased? A decrease is behind many dizzy and fainting spells. High blood pressure is a little more difficult. Long term, it can cause damage to the arteries and consequential blockages known as atherosclerotic plaques. Another example is metabolic and relates to sugar. Diabetes is just such a situation. Cells cannot take up sugar, and therefore the body becomes inundated in a state known as hyperglycemia. Single cells are not exempt from this. They can be overwhelmed by simple but more powerful forces. Water is a good case study with the ability to cause hyper or hypotonic states. This occurs through osmotic forces. To a degree, more complex cells can mitigate the differences in osmotic pressure, but only to some degree. This is of course only a simple set of examples, and the processes can become far more complex and involve many more independent processes. Blood pressure is a case in point, as is breathing and even sugar regulation. But for the purposes of this video, understand that a living organism requires many different systems in place to maintain homeostasis. These exist to provide a stimulus and response system. The living organism can respond to the environment even at a cellular level because of this. The switch between anaerobic and aerobic respiration is the perfect example. Skin tanning is another that is readily apparent in humans. Less obvious is the ability to utilize different energy sources. Bacteria often have a preferred sugar source or energy source. They rely on this preferentially because they can more effectively metabolize it. When it's no longer available, they begin choosing things based on what they can and cannot access, and what they can and cannot metabolize. This leads into the many adages, axioms, and sayings about development or growth in life. These are true of it in most respects. This could be as simple as an increase in number. A pair of gametes can become a whole human under the right circumstances. Cancer cells proliferate, as do microorganisms. They all grow, if not in size, at least in number. They all grow, and the growth is limited by a few things. The most obvious is the supply of nutrition, water, and air, or at least in the case of humans. There are also other features like pathogens, but in an ideal world we can count on only nutrition, water, and air to dictate whether or not humans would be able to increase and grow. Bacteria have similar requirements, but they will self-limit up to a point or engage in a form of cannibalism where they salvage material from dead cells. Unlike humans, cells by themselves, and particularly microbes, can engage in reproduction, and it is essential for everything mentioned previously. Both sexual reproduction and the less involved but still definitely complex cellular division or asexual reproduction is necessary for something to be living, and it should be something that most people are familiar with to some extent. Reproduction allows humans to create smaller, similar-shaped organisms from themselves. While that process is complex at an individual organism level, it is similar to what a microbe undergoes. It is known as mitosis. This is also the process that leads to a tumor, where the body itself must have cellular division and reproduction in order to maintain its state. Microbial organisms do undergo a similar process of cellular division or reproduction. This is a controlled process that is limited by access to the necessary resources for it to occur. If there aren't resources available, cellular reproduction does not occur. As has been mentioned, all of this is geared towards the process of evolution. Evolution is the benefit and, to a degree, the point of reproduction for both multi- and singular-celled organisms, whereby progeny can inherit beneficial traits. The offspring with superior genes for survival will procreate or divide more frequently, thereby increasing the coverage of that particular genome. Now that we have some solid idea of what is living, why does a virus not fit into this definition? Organization is first, and it's first for a simple reason. Structurally, a virion is largely similar no matter what you are looking at. It has three common core elements: an envelope, viral proteins or spikes which project from this envelope, and its genome. There is not a lot to be said about its organization with so little machinery to the cell's content. This is the first big difference between a living organism and a virus. Everything in its organization is geared towards one objective: injecting the viral genome into the new host cell. We can then ask, what about a virus that could be considered part of metabolism? Honestly, it's very little. They can store a finite amount of energy, enough to get by for a time, and hopefully long enough to get to a new host. What the virus can do is hijack the metabolism of its new host and force it to follow the demanding needs of the virus. This becomes a part of the homeostasis principle we touched on earlier, about maintaining the functionality of the cell. Homeostasis requires many processes and often organelles, channels, gates, and receptors. With so few of any function the virion has available, it can ill afford to dedicate anything to sustaining homeostasis. What it does is, when it gains a new host, the virus instead breaks the homeostasis of the host. It drives everything towards growth and reproduction at the expense of the cell's ability to survive. It's no longer intent on retaining functionality of the cell. What it wants is to increase the cell's growth. Growth is facilitated by the death of the host cell for a virus. This is a subtle and insidious process at first. It railroads the normal process of homeostasis that facilitates cellular reproduction and growth, and instead puts it into overdrive. It creates many more copies of genes, or what the cell thinks is a gene, but is in fact the viral genome. It is this element that you need to keep in mind. For a virus, the host must grow as it allows it to parasitize it more effectively, thereby creating more virions. This is a function of the volume and consequential surface area of the cell. The cell's wall will become the new virion's envelope, but it is not a self-sacrificing process, but a selfish death by the virus. It is this reproduction is key to the virus and how it lives. Like a parasite, it survives in the host, but only for a time. It must use that host to create more copies of itself, something it cannot do by itself, and therefore it is unable to reproduce normally. It must kill the host in order to replicate and create more copies of itself in suitable carrier molecules. This is the sole goal of the virus, and so it cannot respond to the environment. In fact, there is a great big question about just how it might do so. There is no gene for a response or structures that could respond. Think of it this way: if you only had blueprints to build a square box, and something requires a round box, how can you respond? Evolution is the final hurdle, and here there is a lot of contention. Is it surreptitious mutation or natural selection that evolves a virus? Considering what the virus is made from, envelope, spikes, genome, it doesn't have a lot of machinery to ensure that any mutations that occur are quickly dealt with and effectively. In fact, there's very little proofing mechanisms in place. In one study they were looking at this, and they found that through exposure to a cell that had a particular new receptor, a virus was able to quickly and effectively mutate and adapt to this new host. This could occur in as few as 4 generations. That's incredibly fast in terms of evolution. When we're looking at viruses overall, there is one both slight but major exception to this: giant viruses. They are a tiny cluster within the virus phylogenetic tree. They are an exception to this because they can have genes for metabolic processes. A giant virus is, as the name would suggest, large. So large that for a long time they were not thought to be a virus, but perhaps a protozoa. These large viruses tend to contain far bigger genomes than what you'd find in a regular virus. What they also find within these are many metabolic genes that are responsible for modifying how the cells will use or extract energy. This is something you would typically expect to find inside of a cell that is living. Think of your microbes. But almost never in a virus. And we say almost never because the giant viruses are that exception. This means that, at least in a large living cell, they have the ability to hijack and push certain metabolic pathways in living cells that other viruses aren't able to as effectively use. What is really interesting is the fact that these genes aren't just genetic bits and pieces that were picked up along the way, something that was acquired and not disposed of, but instead the virus can use it and respond to a certain degree to the environment by initiating these genes in response to something the host encounters. This, to a certain degree, puts forward an argument that the virus can respond to the environment and does, to some extent, have a metabolism. Ultimately, the status of viruses as alive or dead is largely philosophical. The nature of the argument doesn't owe much to anything that we're using on a regular basis. The same rules about mutation and evolution apply to the virus as they do to an otherwise living cell. Perhaps the only difference is the complexity of what is within the virion. Is it filled with machinery necessary for keeping it alive? Or is it a fundamental delivery vehicle that has one purpose: deliver the genome to a new host where it can achieve what it needs to do? Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.